The 24th of November, 1971. The Portland Airport terminal hummed with the rhythmic chaos of midday travel. Suitcases clicked against linoleum floors, and the public address system droned through flight updates. Amidst the frantic pace of commuters and families, a man stepped through the sliding glass doors. He moved with a deliberate, measured gait. No one turned to look. He did not rush, nor did he scan the room for exits. He simply navigated the crowd, his gaze fixed forward, until he reached the Northwest Orient Airlines counter. The clerk looked up, prepared for the standard inquiry. The man placed his hands on the counter. He spoke in a voice that was level and polite. Devoid of any edge or urgency, he requested a one-way ticket to Seattle. The name he provided was Dan Cooper. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the exact amount in cash, and laid the bills flat on the counter. The exchange was efficient, almost mundane. He took the ticket, tucked it away, and turned back toward the terminal concourse. He walked with the steady, unremarkable rhythm of a man who had no intention of ever being remembered. He was already gone before he had even begun. The gate area was thick with the scent of jet fuel and impatience. Passengers jostled for position, clutching boarding passes. But Dan Cooper held his place in the queue with a stillness that felt out of place. When he finally stepped onto the jet bridge, he did not look back at the terminal. He walked down the narrow aisle of Flight 305, his eyes sweeping the cabin with clinical precision before he reached row 18. He took seat 18C, an aisle position that offered him a clear view of the entire cabin. He adjusted his weight, placed his briefcase firmly on the floor between his feet, and sat with his hands folded in his lap. A flight attendant passed by, offering a polite smile. Cooper nodded back, his expression relaxed, even friendly. He reached into his pocket and produced a pack of cigarettes. He tapped one out, brought it to his lips, and clicked a lighter. As the plane began its taxi, the thin trail of smoke curled toward the overhead bins. He exhaled slowly, watching the other passengers settle into their seats. Unaware of the man sitting among them, the cabin grew quiet, the engines rose to a hum, and the plane began to move away from the gate. Cooper remained perfectly still, waiting for the altitude to climb. The seatbelt sign flickered off with a sharp metallic click. The cabin pressure stabilized, and the engines settled into a steady, rhythmic drone. Florence Schaffner moved down the aisle, collecting empty cups and checking on the passengers. She reached row 18. Dan Cooper sat with his briefcase still tucked against his legs, his demeanor unchanged. As she moved to pass, he extended his hand. He held a small, folded scrap of paper. His movements were precise, lacking any tremor or hesitation. He did not speak. He simply offered the note with a slight, polite inclination of his head. Florence paused, her expression shifting into a practiced, professional smile. She took the paper from his fingers, assuming it was a comment on the service or perhaps a clumsy attempt at a flirtation, a common occurrence on these long-haul flights. She did not open it. Instead, she tucked the note into her purse, her mind already moving to the next row of passengers. Cooper watched her walk away. He did not lean forward. He did not alter his posture. He simply rested his hands on his knees and looked toward the window, where the clouds stretched out in a flat, indifferent horizon. He waited for her to return, his patience absolute. As the plane continued its climb into the thinning air, Florence moved back toward the rear of the cabin, her focus on the galley. She had already dismissed the interaction at row 18, her thoughts occupied by the upcoming meal service. A chime echoed through the cabin. She paused, turned, and walked back toward the middle rows. Cooper was waiting. He had not shifted his position, but the air around his seat felt different. He watched her approach with an intensity that made her hesitate. As she reached his row, she started to offer a standard greeting, but he cut her off. He did not raise his voice. He leaned toward her, his posture rigid. The background hum of the aircraft engines seemed to drop away. He spoke, each word measured and devoid of inflection. "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words landed with the weight of a physical blow. Florence stopped breathing for a second. The aisle, a moment ago a workspace, became a trap. She looked at him, searching for a sign of a joke, a twitch of a smile, anything to soften the statement. She found nothing. His expression was as blank as a stone. The polite stranger had vanished, replaced by a man who had already calculated the next 10 minutes of her life. She stood frozen, the reality of the situation sinking in as the cabin continued its steady climb through the sky. Florence stood paralyzed in the aisle. The air in the cabin felt thin and sharp. Cooper did not wait for her to process the shock. He reached down to the floor and pulled the briefcase onto his lap. The movement was deliberate, calculated, and slow. He placed his hands on the twin metal latches. They clicked open in unison, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the low drone of the jet engines. He tilted the lid back just enough for her to see inside. There, nestled against the padding, lay a collection of red cylinders bound tightly together with thick, dark wire. A small, primitive battery sat connected to the web of circuits. It was not a prop. The mass of it, the cold precision of the wiring, and the way the light caught the copper contacts made the threat undeniable. Florence felt a tremor run through her hands. The sight of the device stripped away any lingering doubt. The danger was not a possibility. It was an immediate, ticking reality. Cooper kept his eyes locked on her, his expression unyielding. He had displayed the instruments of destruction with the same calm he used to buy his ticket. The briefcase remained open, a black void resting on his knees, holding the lives of everyone on board in its fragile, lethal configuration. Florence stumbled back, the narrow space of the aisle closing in. Cooper remained unmoved, his focus shifting from the briefcase to a small pad of paper. He slid it across the tray table toward her. Her hand shook as she reached for it, the paper feeling heavy in her grip. It was a list, written in clear, block letters. $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, a fuel truck waiting on the tarmac in Seattle. The specificity of the items turned the air in the cabin stagnant. He watched her read the list, his eyes tracking her every movement. He did not wait for a response. He signaled for her to take the note to the cockpit. She turned, walking toward the front of the plane with stiff, mechanical steps. Every passenger she passed seemed oblivious to the shift in reality. She reached the cockpit door and knocked, her pulse thudding against her temples. The door opened just enough for her to slide the note through. Inside, the pilots read the demands. The flight path remained steady, but the internal atmosphere had splintered. The crew was no longer flying a commercial route. They were negotiating for survival. Cooper sat back in his seat, the briefcase still resting on his lap, waiting for the world below to react to his terms. The cabin remained unnervingly still. Cooper closed his briefcase, the latches snapping shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet space. He looked up at Florence, who stood hovering near his row, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He did not look like a man holding a plane hostage. He looked like a commuter expecting service. He spoke clearly, his voice steady and devoid of malice. "I would like a bourbon and soda." Florence hesitated, her mind struggling to reconcile the bomb she had just seen with the request for a drink. She moved toward the galley, her limbs feeling weighted by the absurdity of the situation. She returned moments later, placing the glass on his tray table. Cooper took it, the ice clinking against the crystal. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a stack of bills, and laid them on the tray. "Keep the change," he said, his tone casual, almost conversational. He took a slow sip, eyes scanning the cabin as if he were merely waiting for a connecting flight. The tip remained on the tray, a crisp, paper reminder of his bizarre, calculated control. He sat back, relaxed, watching the clouds drift past the window while the rest of the plane existed in a state of suspended, suffocating dread. The Boeing 727 banked hard, entering a wide circular holding pattern above the Seattle horizon. Below, the city lights flickered in the dusk, a grid of indifference to the crisis unfolding in the sky. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick with the smell of recycled ventilation and nervous sweat. The pilots kept the jet steady, circling the dark expanse while the FBI mobilized on the ground. Every minute felt like an hour. Cooper remained in seat 18C, his gaze fixed on the window, watching the landscape repeat itself. He did not pace. He did not mutter. He simply waited, his stillness acting as a physical weight on the flight crew. Florence moved through the cabin, her eyes darting toward him, hoping for a lapse in his resolve, a sign of fatigue, anything to shatter the tension. He never looked back. He remained a statue of calm, his hand resting near the briefcase. The cockpit radio crackled with urgent, garbled transmissions from the authorities below, but Cooper ignored the chatter. He knew the clock was ticking, and he knew he had all the time in the world. The plane continued its endless orbit, a captive bird trapped in a loop of his design, while the ground below scrambled to meet the demands of a man who refused to blink. On the ground, the airport tarmac transformed into a high-stakes command center. FBI agents moved with precision, their voices cutting through the cold night air as they coordinated the massive logistical response. The demand for $200,000 in cash meant sourcing specific, non-sequential bills from local banks, a frantic operation that drained the registers of multiple branches. Phones rang incessantly in the tower. Personnel scrambled to secure the required 4 parachutes, scouring hangars for military-grade equipment that met the hijackers' precise specifications. A fuel truck stood ready, its engine idling, a heavy, metallic presence against the dark runway. Every second counted. Agents checked serial numbers, verified the weight of the bundles, and triple-checked the deployment mechanisms of the chutes. The scale of the response was unprecedented. It was not just a police action. It was a desperate race against a clock that the man in seat 18C controlled. By the time the final knapsack was sealed, the airport resembled a war zone of lights, sirens, and tension. They had the money, they had the gear, they had the fuel. The trap was set, but the authorities knew that meeting the demands was only the beginning of a volatile, unknown endgame. The heavy landing gear dropped with a metallic thud, echoing through the cabin as the Boeing 727 aligned with the runway. The jet descended through the low cloud layer, the city lights below expanding into a blinding, complex web of activity. Cooper did not move, his eyes locked on the approaching tarmac. The plane hit the asphalt with a jarring bounce, the engines roaring into reverse thrust as the fuselage shuddered under the strain. He watched as the runway markers blurred past, the aircraft slowing to a crawl. Outside, a fuel truck crept toward the plane, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a warning. The cabin was deathly quiet now, save for the hum of the auxiliary power unit. Cooper stood, his weight shifting in the aisle, his presence dominating the cramped space. He peered through the thick glass of the exit door, scanning the perimeter. Armed agents were visible in the distance, their silhouettes frozen in the glare of the floodlights. The plane came to a complete, final halt. The engines died. A profound, heavy silence settled over the tarmac, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. The standoff had arrived. Every breath inside the cabin felt measured, every movement a potential trigger for violence. The seal of the main cabin door hissed as the pressure equalized. When it swung open, the biting night air flooded the aisle. Cooper stood near the bulkhead, his gaze fixed on the exit, counting heads as the passengers shuffled forward. There was no conversation. The passengers moved with a desperate, hurried rhythm, their faces tight with suppressed terror as they stepped onto the metal stairs and down to the tarmac. Some looked back, but Cooper remained a shadow in the dim light, his hand never straying far from the briefcase. One by one, they cleared the aircraft, their footsteps echoing on the metal until the last individual vanished into the darkness outside. The cabin suddenly felt cavernous. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Cooper turned his attention to the crew. He gestured toward the knapsack, now resting on the seat, the canvas sagging under the weight of the ransom. The exchange was complete. The passengers were safe, but the stakes had shifted entirely. Cooper remained, a solitary figure in the back, while the pilots and remaining flight attendants stayed under his direct command. The aircraft was no longer a transport vessel. It was an isolated, flying cell, and the prisoner was now the one holding the keys to their fate. Cooper moved forward, his voice a flat, precise directive that cut through the cockpit's static. He outlined the new heading, south, toward Mexico, low altitude. Speed kept strictly under 200 knots. The pilot stared at the charts, his hands hovering over the throttles, and suggested a higher flight ceiling for safety. Cooper did not argue. He simply repeated the constraints. The cabin pressure had to remain at sea level. The landing gear was to stay fully extended. The pilot's knuckles turned white as he complied. The hydraulic systems whined in protest as the heavy undercarriage locked into place, creating a constant, shuddering drag that vibrated through the floorboards. The plane was now sluggish, heavy, and exposed. Cooper returned to the cabin, the heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He checked the seal on the rear exit, his movements rhythmic and devoid of hesitation. Every instruction he had given shifted the aircraft from a commercial liner into a fragile, low-flying target. Outside, the horizon darkened, the clouds thickening into a bruised, solid mass. The cockpit crew exchanged a single, silent look. They knew the flight path was a death trap, yet they had no choice but to follow the heading he had etched into their flight plan. The engines labored against the wind, driving the plane forward into the void. The engines roared, a deep, uneven thrum that vibrated through the fuselage as the plane taxied onto the runway. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the runway lights into indistinct streaks of white and yellow. The aircraft lurched forward, fighting the crosswinds that battered the wings. Cooper gestured toward the cockpit door with a sharp, downward motion. He waited, his eyes tracking the flight attendants as they retreated, their movements stiff and hurried. He did not follow. He stood by the bulkhead watching the door click shut. The lock engaged with a final metallic snap. He was alone. The cabin lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the empty rows of seats. Outside, the storm intensified. The plane lifted, the nose pitching upward into the dark, churning sky. Every turbulence-induced drop sent the floor falling away beneath his feet. The wind howled against the metal skin, a constant, abrasive roar that drowned out the hum of the engines. He checked the knapsack, his fingers tightening on the strap. The cabin pressure system groaned, struggling to maintain equilibrium against the external force of the gale. He moved to the rear of the plane, his boots heavy on the floorboards, isolated in the center of the shaking vessel as the ground vanished into the black abyss below. The clock on the bulkhead clicked to 8. Cooper moved to the rear of the cabin, his hands steady as he reached for the locking mechanism of the aft stairs. He pulled the lever. The heavy latch resisted, then groaned. A sharp, high-pitched whistle of escaping air pierced the roar of the engines. The cabin pressure gauge on the wall plummeted, the needle vibrating against the red line as the internal environment began to equalize with the freezing gale outside. Cooper braced his feet against the floorboards and heaved the handle downward. With a mechanical thud that rattled the entire fuselage, the door began to lower. A vacuum of air tore into the cabin, instantly extinguishing the overhead lights. Rain sprayed inward in a jagged horizontal sheet, turning the aisle into a wind tunnel of mist and debris. The temperature plummeted, turning his breath into thick, swirling clouds. The plane bucked, caught in a massive updraft that sent loose seat cushions and paper trash flying toward the open maw of the rear exit. Below the stairs, the dark, jagged peaks of the wilderness waited. The wind screamed through the opening, a deafening, unrelenting force that filled the cabin and shook the plane to its core. He stepped toward the threshold, the gale pulling at his weight, preparing for the final drop. The wind tore at him, a physical weight pushing against his chest. Cooper stood at the threshold of the open staircase, his boots sliding against the damp, vibrating metal. Below, the darkness was absolute, a swirling abyss of rain and freezing mist. He shifted his weight, his knuckles white as he gripped the heavy bag of cash against his side. A sudden, violent updraft rocked the plane, nearly pitching him backward into the cabin. He slammed his hand against the doorframe to steady himself, his muscles straining against the relentless force of the gale. The air was so cold it burned his lungs with every inhalation. He looked down one last time, seeing only the blurred, jagged silhouettes of trees passing at terminal velocity. There was no hesitation left. He tightened his grip on the strap, tucked his chin, and threw his body forward into the void. The wind caught him instantly, tearing him away from the safety of the stairs. He became a dark, tumbling shape, swallowed by the clouds. The plane groaned, the fuselage shuddering as the weight shifted, and then he was gone. Only the rain remained, lashing against the empty, hanging staircase as the aircraft continued to climb, leaving him alone in the freezing, silent dark of the wilderness. The plane leveled out, the violent shaking subsiding as the weight vanished from the rear. In the cockpit, the pilots fought the controls, compensating for the sudden shift in balance that had left the jet nose heavy. They checked the gauges, watching the pressure return to normal as the cabin air stabilized, but the silence in the back was absolute. No sound came from the rear galley, no movement. The flight crew remained strapped in their seats, following the strict instructions to stay isolated. Minutes stretched into hours. The fuel levels dropped. The navigation lights of Reno finally appeared on the horizon, a cluster of steady, artificial stars against the black desert floor. The landing gear deployed with a heavy hydraulic thud. As the wheels hit the tarmac, the ground crew rushed toward the idling jet. They stopped, dead. The rear staircase was not retracted. It hung low, scraping against the runway, vibrating in the residual wind. The lights in the cabin remained dimmed. A ground officer climbed the stairs, stepping into the empty hold. He moved down the aisle, past row 18, past the abandoned seat. Every overhead compartment was closed. The cabin was vacant. The space where the man had been was now just cold, still air. He was gone. The FBI mobilized within hours, christening the investigation Operation Norjack. Teams of agents arrived in the Pacific Northwest, establishing command posts in damp, makeshift tents. They coordinated with local law enforcement, military paratroopers, and search and rescue units. The search area spanned hundreds of square miles of dense, unforgiving wilderness. Men pushed through thick underbrush that tore at their gear, while others dragged hooks through the frigid, fast-moving currents of the Columbia River. Days turned into weeks. The initial confidence of the investigators eroded with every empty grid square they cleared. They found nothing. No parachute canopy snagged in the high branches. No discarded evidence. No footprints in the mud that didn't belong to the searchers themselves. The terrain fought them at every turn, with steep, jagged ridges and endless miles of pine forest that swallowed sound and light alike. The frustration grew among the lead agents as they sat in briefing rooms, staring at maps that offered no answers. They interviewed hundreds of individuals, cross-referenced every lead, and followed every trail to its dead end. The conviction that they would find the man slowly transformed into a hollow, gnawing disbelief. The forest had simply claimed him, leaving the investigators with nothing but a void where a suspect should have been. 9 years passed. The files grew thick with dust, and the search became a ghost story told in local taverns. The wilderness had kept its secrets well, hiding the truth beneath layers of silt and pine needles. Then, in 1980, the river gave back a piece of the puzzle. 8-year-old Brian Ingram was digging into the sand along the banks of the Columbia River, his hands moving through the grit and debris. His fingers brushed against something hard and unnaturally rectangular. He pulled, dragging 3 heavy, sodden bundles from the earth. The packaging was shredded by time, the paper turned to gray pulp, but the contents remained. Rotting, waterlogged cash spilled into the light. The serial numbers were still legible, matching the ransom records from that night on the plane. The discovery hit the investigators like a physical blow. It was the first tangible evidence since the jump, yet it offered no path to a suspect. The money had survived the fall, the river, and the freezing winters, but the man who carried it had not. The physical reality of the rotting cash provided a chilling, final clue. The treasure was here, buried in the mud, but the thief had vanished into the earth entirely, leaving only the silence of the river in his wake. The discovery of the cache ignited a decades-long frenzy of speculation. Suspects rose from the shadows, their names whispered in newsrooms and police precincts across the country. Richard McCoy Jr., Robert Rackstraw, and dozens of others were dragged into the spotlight, each scrutinized against the thin profile of the man in seat 18C. Agents analyzed every grainy photograph and cross-referenced every military record, yet the pieces never fit. One man lacked the height, another had the wrong background. Every lead that promised a breakthrough dissolved under closer inspection. The investigators watched as their physical evidence remained stubbornly silent. No fingerprint ever matched the samples left on the flight. No confession surfaced to break the stalemate. The public, starved for a conclusion, began to fill the vacuum with their own theories, turning the man into a phantom. He became a symbol of the perfect crime, a figure who defied the reach of the law and the passage of time. The mystery shifted from a cold case file to the bedrock of regional folklore. Every year, the details blurred, the facts grew polished by repetition, and the man known as Dan Cooper became untouchable. The legal system had reached its limit, and the truth once so close, slipped permanently into the realm of legend. In July 2016, the federal agents finally set the pen down. The case that had spanned 4 decades was officially marked as closed. There were no press conferences to declare a victory, no final reveal of a name, and no closure for the families who had waited for answers. The shelves in the archive were cleared of the binders, and the investigation simply ceased to exist as an active pursuit. The man who had walked into the Portland airport as a stranger, polite and unremarkable, remained exactly that. He had demanded a fortune, stepped into a freezing, violent abyss, and vanished without a trace. He left behind no fingerprints, no confession, and no wreckage. He did not leave a footprint in the mud or a memory that could be verified. He merely dissolved into the dark, a phantom who had claimed his moment in the sky and then retreated into the silence of history. He was no longer a criminal to be caught or a riddle to be solved. He had become something permanent, a figure woven into the fabric of the Pacific Northwest. He stepped onto the plane as a man, and he stepped off into the night as a legend, leaving the world with nothing but the empty space where a truth should have been.